A simple family portrait, a mother seated between her two daughters. Nothing out of the ordinary at first glance, but look closer at their hands. Shift your focus, and everything changes. Dr. James Mitchell had spent 15 years of his career studying photographic archives at the New York Historical Society. He had viewed countless images from America's past, daguerreotypes, tintypes, albumen prints. Yet nothing in all that experience prepared him for what arrived one ordinary Tuesday morning. The package came from an estate sale in Brooklyn. Inside, carefully wrapped in fragile newspaper dated 1923, were dozens of glass plate negatives. Most showed exactly what you'd expect from the late 1800s, stern businessmen with elaborate mustaches, wedding celebrations frozen in time, children uncomfortably dressed in their Sunday best. But one image made Dr. Mitchell's breath catch. 3 women stared back at him through the veil of over a century. The mother, around 40 years old, sat in an intricately carved wooden chair at the center. Her daughters, young women in their late teens or early 20s, flanked her on both sides with protective stances. All 3 were African American, dressed in what were clearly their most treasured garments. Their high-collared dresses, with elaborate lace work, spoke of painstaking craftsmanship. Their hair had been styled with obvious care and intention. Behind them stretched a painted backdrop of an idealized garden scene, standard for portrait studios of that era. And if you're drawn to hidden histories and secrets buried in plain sight, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. Drop a like on this video right now, it helps more people discover these incredible untold stories. Trust me, what comes next will absolutely blow your mind. What caught James's attention wasn't the beautiful composition or the dignified expressions of these 3 remarkable women. It was something far more subtle, something that demanded a closer look: their hands. The mother's hands rested on her lap, but the positioning of her fingers was entirely unconventional. Her right thumb crossed deliberately over her left. Her index and middle fingers pointed outward, while her remaining fingers curled inward in a precise formation. This wasn't a natural resting pose, it was intentional, purposeful, coded. The daughters had placed their hands on their mother's shoulders, a common gesture of family affection for the era, but their fingers weren't simply resting there. They were arranged in specific patterns, deliberate angles, calculated positions that mirrored variations of their mother's hand signals. James had spent his entire career examining Victorian-era photography. He knew the technical demands intimately. Exposure times required subjects to stay completely still, sometimes for 30 seconds or more. Every single element in these photos was carefully orchestrated by the photographer: the tilt of a head, the placement of a prop, the positioning of limbs. These hand configurations were far too specific, too purposeful, too precise to be coincidence or comfortable resting positions. He reached for his magnifying glass and examined the glass negative with fresh intensity. There in the bottom right corner, almost invisible to casual viewing, someone had scratched tiny characters directly into the glass: New York 89247. A chill ran down James's spine. This wasn't just a family portrait. It was something else entirely. That evening, sleep eluded Dr. Mitchell. He returned to his Upper West Side apartment and turned his dining table into a research command center, reference books, archival documents, and his laptop competing for space on every available surface. He had taken high-resolution digital photos of the glass negative earlier that day. Now the portrait filled his computer screen with startling clarity. The detail preserved in this 130-year-old image was remarkable even by modern standards. He could see individual threads in the fabric of their dresses, the delicate engravings on the small brooch at the mother's collar, and even subtle differences in facial features between the 2 sisters. But his attention stayed fixed on those hands, zooming in until individual fingers filled the display. The deliberate nature of the posing became undeniable. The mother's right thumb crossing over her left required conscious, sustained effort throughout the long exposure. Her extended fingers formed a distinctive shape, almost like a visual letter or symbol. The daughter's hands on her shoulders showed complementary configurations, different yet clearly related, fingers bent at angles that demanded specific intention, thumbs placed with obvious purpose. James had extensive knowledge of Civil War photography, Reconstruction-era documentation, and early 20th century social reform movements. He knew that activists operating underground networks throughout American history had developed sophisticated visual communication systems. Certain poses carried hidden meanings, specific objects placed in frames served as signals, even the direction a subject faced could transmit messages to those educated to read such codes. Quilts hung on clotheslines with particular patterns, spirituals sung with specific verses, arrangements of common household items. Throughout America's darkest chapters, oppressed people had created ingenious communication methods that worked invisibly beneath the notice of those who sought to control them. He opened his research database on abolitionist networks and post-emancipation activist organizations. The Underground Railroad's coded quilts and freedom songs represented just one chapter in this long tradition of visual resistance. But this photograph dated from 1892, nearly 3 decades after the Emancipation Proclamation, 15 years after Reconstruction's collapse. The official mechanisms of enslavement had been dismantled, at least on paper. What networks could still require secret codes this late in the century? What danger still lurked that demanded such elaborate precautions? His phone lit up with a response from Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the foremost scholars of African American history at his institution. She had received his cryptic text from earlier that evening, *free tomorrow morning. What did you find? James typed his reply carefully, something that might fundamentally reshape our understanding of post-Reconstruction activism in New York. Bring everything you have on property rights struggles and documentation challenges facing black families in the 1890s, Sarah arrived at the Historical Society at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, carrying a worn leather satchel bulging with years of accumulated research materials. James had prepared the research room, projecting the portrait onto the wall at massive scale. The 3 women gazed down at them with quiet, unshakable dignity. Examine their hands, James directed, the red dot of his laser pointer tracing the deliberate configurations. Every single finger positioned with obvious intention. This was planned, choreographed, meaningful. Sarah approached the projection slowly, her trained eyes narrowing as she processed what she saw. She set down her bag and pulled out a thick folder of photocopied documents. After Reconstruction collapsed in 1877, she began, her voice taking on the measured cadence of a scholar assembling puzzle pieces. African American families across the northern states faced a different kind of struggle. Not the overt brutality of enslavement, but systematic bureaucratic exclusion. Property rights became battlegrounds. Inheritance claims were contested and denied. Even basic proof of identity became a weapon wielded against black citizens by a hostile system. She spread her documents across the research table, legal filings, municipal records, newspaper clippings from the 1880s and 1890s, court proceedings, property disputes. Each told part of a larger, troubling story. New York was never the progressive sanctuary that popular imagination portrays, Sarah continued. African American families faced relentless obstacles in maintaining property ownership, establishing legitimate businesses, proving their marriages were legally valid. Countless families had fled the violence and persecution of the post-Reconstruction South, carrying nothing but their word and their memories. No birth certificates existed for people born into bondage. No marriage licenses for unions performed in secret. No official paperwork acknowledged their basic humanity. James retrieved a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1891. The headline read, "Property Dispute in Harlem, Family Claims Ownership Without Documentation." This was everywhere, Sarah observed. Families who had purchased property legally, who had built homes and businesses with their own hands, found themselves unable to prove ownership when challenged by white claimants or corrupt officials. The documentation systems that protected white citizens simply didn't extend to black families, whether through deliberate exclusion or calculated indifference. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I've spent the last 3 years researching mutual aid societies from this period. African American communities across the Northeast developed sophisticated networks to help members navigate these hostile systems. They pooled resources to retain sympathetic attorneys, shared intelligence about which officials might be cooperative, and developed their own verification systems when official mechanisms refused to acknowledge their existence. Secret networks, James murmured, the implications crystallizing in his mind. Sarah shook her head slightly. Not secret in the sense of hidden or clandestine, secret in the sense of parallel. Operating alongside official systems, using methods that white authorities either failed to recognize or simply couldn't comprehend. These communities built entire support infrastructures that functioned invisibly, not because they were ashamed, but because visibility meant vulnerability. James turned back to the projection, studying the three women with fresh understanding. What if this isn't simply a family portrait, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if it's documentation? What if these hand positions encode information that network members could read and verify? The etched numbers proved to be the key that unlocked everything. New York 89247. After 48 exhausting hours of searching through city directories, business registrations, and commercial records from the era, James finally found a reference that made sense. Studio 247 belonged to a professional photographer named Thomas Wright, who ran his business from a building on 8th Avenue between 1888 and 1896. The address still existed on modern maps. James went there on a crisp autumn afternoon, standing on the sidewalk and gazing up at the aged brick facade. The building had long since been subdivided into apartments, its commercial history forgotten, but James could envision it as it once stood, Wright's portrait studio on the second floor, positioned to capture the soft, diffused northern light that photographers of that era prized above all else. Research into Thomas Wright himself revealed something completely unexpected. Wright was white. Born in Massachusetts in 1851, he had trained as a photographer in Boston before moving to New York in 1887 to open his own studio. He chose a neighborhood undergoing rapid demographic change, Irish immigrant families, Italian newcomers, and a steadily growing African American community migrating north from the violence of the post-Reconstruction South. But Wright's business practices set him apart from virtually every other white photographer of the period. Most white studio owners either refused African American clients entirely or charged them inflated prices for inferior service. Degradation was the norm, dignity was reserved for white customers. Wright operated differently. Sarah discovered that Wright had placed ads in African American newspapers across the city. His studio explicitly welcomed all customers and charged the same rates regardless of race. In an era of rigid segregation and casual cruelty, such policies were a radical statement. She uncovered a newspaper interview Wright had given to a small progressive publication in 1894. He spoke passionately about photography as an instrument of dignity and documentation. Every human being, he argued, regardless of background or circumstances, deserves a portrait of genuine quality, an image that captures their fundamental humanity and worth reading between the lines. James detected something deeper, a quiet activism, a deliberate choice to serve a community that mainstream society had chosen to exclude and demean. He was an ally, Sarah concluded, reading over James's shoulder as he studied the archival material. A genuine partner in whatever this network was building. And if these hand positions form some kind of coding system, Wright would have been the one helping create them, capture them, and distribute them to those who needed this information. James reached out to Dr. Marcus Thompson, a renowned cryptography historian at Columbia University who specialized in visual communication systems throughout history. Marcus arrived at the Historical Society that afternoon, his curiosity sparked by James's deliberately mysterious invitation. Coding systems from the Victorian period often look impossibly complex to modern observers, Marcus explained, carefully examining the enlarged portrait. But they were typically quite practical for the people who actually used them. The key to understanding any code lies in its context: who needed to communicate, what information had to be transmitted, and who were they hiding it from? He photographed the hand positions from multiple angles, then opened his laptop and began creating precise digital tracings of each configuration. Let's start with a basic assumption, he proposed. Each distinct hand position likely represents something specific, but probably not individual letters. That would be far too complex to capture reliably in a single photo requiring a long exposure. More likely, we're looking at categories, confirmations, status indicators, types of information that could be conveyed through a limited vocabulary of gestures. Sarah retrieved her research on documentation struggles. What if this system encoded identity verification? These networks desperately needed reliable methods to confirm who people were, to establish that someone was a legitimate community member, to determine whether an individual could be trusted with sensitive information or dangerous knowledge. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his fingers tracing the outlines of the mother's hand position on his tablet. Following that logic, the mother's specific hand configuration might indicate her role within the network: family head, verified member, someone authorized to vouch for others. The daughter's positions could communicate their particular status: documented, undocumented, actively seeking assistance. They worked through the remainder of the afternoon and into the evening, comparing the portrait to additional photographs James had found in the estate sale boxes. 3 more portraits showed similar hand positioning, always subtle, always deliberate, always purposeful. In one image, a couple's intertwined fingers formed a distinctive pattern. In another, a man's hand rested on a Bible with specific fingers extended at precise angles. This isn't a single code, Marcus concluded as night fell outside the research room windows. This is an entire system, multiple signals capable of combination to convey different meanings depending on circumstance and need. Someone trained these families how to pose. Someone photographed them with deliberate intention. And someone else, other network members, possessed the knowledge to read these images and extract the encoded information. Sarah made the breakthrough that opened everything up while investigating property rights cases processed through New York courts during the 1890s. She identified a striking pattern: dozens of African American families had successfully defended their property claims, obtained identity documentation, or established legal proof of their marriages during this period. Many of these victories occurred in cases that should have been hopeless, families lacking the conventional documentation that courts typically required. One attorney's name appeared again and again throughout the records: Robert Hayes. Hayes maintained law offices on West 34th Street. Court records showed an unusual winning percentage for his black clients in an era when such legal victories remained exceedingly rare. More significantly, his case files often included an unusual category of evidence: photographic portraits of the families he represented, documentation of their respectability, visual proof of their presence within established communities. He was using rights photographs as legal evidence, James realized, the connections multiplying in his mind. Not just as proof of physical identity, but as verification of community standing. These families were photographed according to specific protocols. Their images were cataloged systematically. When they needed documentation for legal proceedings, Hayes could present these portraits to judges as evidence of their legitimate place in the community. But the discovery went further still. Within Hayes's archived case files at the New York Public Library, Sarah uncovered correspondence that illuminated the network's full scope: letters exchanged between Hayes and other activists, teachers, ministers, business owners, community leaders, discussing verification protocols and documentation systems with careful precision. One letter dated March 1893 proved particularly revelatory. Hayes had written to a minister serving a congregation in Brooklyn: "We have expanded our photographic documentation to include 73 families. Mr. Wright continues providing his services at minimal cost, understanding the vital importance of this work. The hand positioning system allows us to encode essential information that can be verified by other network members at later dates. Each portrait serves dual purposes: dignified representation for the family and practical identification for our documentation system." James sat back from the table, momentarily overwhelmed by the implications. They constructed an entire parallel documentation infrastructure, he said quietly. Asterisk when official channels failed these families, when the systems designed to protect citizens deliberately excluded them, they created their own mechanisms of protection. And they concealed it in plain sight, asterisk Sarah added, asterisk these portraits appeared to be ordinary family photographs. No one looking casually would notice anything unusual or suspicious. But to network members who understood the code, each portrait contained vital information about the people pictured, asterisk. With the network structure emerging from the historical shadows, James became consumed with identifying the three women in the original portrait that had started everything. The estate sale had come from a brownstone in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, a neighborhood with deep and enduring African-American roots stretching back generations. The Historical Society's donor records provided the seller's name, Patricia Johnson, who had inherited the property from her grandmother. James called Patricia that evening, unsure what reception to expect. She was 72, her voice sharp and clear, initially skeptical about his interest in old family photographs gathering dust in storage. But when he described the portrait in careful detail, the three women, the ornate chair, the hand positions, her tone changed entirely. My great-great-grandmother, she said quietly, emotion coloring her words. Asterisk that's Ella Laner. Ella Laner Morrison. The daughters would be my grandmother, Ruth, and her sister, Grace, asterisk please, James requested gently, asterisk tell me about them. Anything you remember or were told, asterisk Patricia paused, gathering memories passed down through 4 generations. Eleanor was born enslaved in Virginia, she began. Asterisk came north after the war ended, carrying Ruth, who was just an infant at the time. Grace was born here in New York, a free child in a free state. Ella Laner worked as a seamstress her whole life. She had remarkable skill with lace and fine embroidery, the most intricate work you could imagine. That's how she supported the family for decades, asterisk. Did she ever mention being involved with any organizations? James pressed carefully. Community groups, anything like that. She was deeply involved in her church, Patricia replied. Asterisk and she helped people. That's what my grandmother always emphasized whenever she spoke about Ella Laner. She helped families with paperwork, with finding housing, with connecting to lawyers who would actually represent them. She seemed to know everyone. She understood how to navigate every system, every obstacle, every closed door, asterisk James's heart rate accelerated. Patricia, I believe your great-great-grandmother was part of something truly significant, a network that helped African-American families document their identities and protect their rights during one of the most dangerous periods in American history after Reconstruction. Silence stretched across the phone line. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion she wasn't trying to hide. Asterisk I always knew she was special. But we lost so much history over the years. After Ella Laner passed in 1919, the family scattered. My grandmother rarely discussed those early years, too painful, maybe. Or maybe she was still protecting something even then, asterisk. With Patricia's blessing and active help, James and Sarah began tracing Eleanor Morrison's connections throughout the community she had served. Church records from Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Brooklyn documented Ella Laner as a member from 1879 until her death 40 years later. She had served on the Ladies' Aid Society, an organization that officially provided charitable assistance to families in need. But the Society's meeting minutes revealed something far more structured and purposeful than simple charity work. The ladies kept meticulous records of every family they assisted, names, ages, circumstances, specific needs, standard information for any charitable organization. But certain entries included mysterious notations that made no sense in a charitable context, numbers and letter combinations that appeared arbitrary until Sarah recognized the pattern. They were cross-referencing, she explained to James, excitement building in her voice as the system revealed itself. Asterisk the Church Society identified families needing documentation. Thomas Wright photographed them using the appropriate hand codes for their situations. Robert Hayes used the photographs in legal proceedings. And the church records maintained the master list of everything, disguised as charity work documentation. It was brilliant. Completely invisible to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. James discovered additional photographs in Wright's archived collection. The Historical Society had acquired his entire body of work after his death in 1923, but no one had ever properly examined or catalogued the materials. Dozens of portraits showed the hand positioning system, families photographed between 1890 and 1896, each image carefully numbered according to the network system, each one documenting people who had been systematically excluded from official records and denied access to conventional documentation. They identified other network members through patient research. Samuel Brooks, a teacher who helped families obtain proper school records for their children when administrators refused to acknowledge their enrollment. Mary Chen, a clerk in the city property office who processed deeds and ensured paperwork was properly filed rather than conveniently lost. Reverend James Washington, a minister who performed marriage ceremonies and provided certificates when official channels refused to recognize. Black unions. Each had taken quiet but genuine risks. Each had used their position within existing systems to help others. Each had operated within structures designed to exclude the very people they chose to serve. Together, they had created something powerful, a shadow archive that preserved dignity and provided protection when official America offered neither recognition nor refuge. 3 months into their research, James and Sarah organized a public exhibition at the Historical Society. They displayed 20 portraits from Thomas Wright's recovered collection, each showing the hand positioning system, each accompanied by carefully researched stories about the family photographed. Patricia Johnson attended opening night, seeing her great-great-grandmother's portrait properly honored for the first time in over a century. She brought her daughter and granddaughter with her, 4 generations of Ella Laner Morrison's descendants standing together before the image that had started everything, the photograph that had waited 130 years to tell its true story. But the exhibition's most powerful moments came when other descendants arrived. James and Sarah had managed to locate families connected to 12 of the photographed individuals. Each brought pieces of the larger story, fragments of oral history passed down through generations, old letters preserved in attic boxes, faded documents that suddenly made sense within the context of the network's activities. An elderly man named Thomas Hayes stood before a portrait of his great-grandfather, the lawyer Robert Hayes, photographed with his hands positioned in that same deliberate code used by the families he had served. "I always heard he helped people," Thomas said quietly, his voice catching. That's what my family said, he helped people who couldn't help themselves. But I never understood the extent of it. Never realized he was part of something this organized, this sophisticated. A woman named Grace Brooks examined a portrait of Samuel Brooks, the teacher who had risked his position to help families document their children's education. "My family told me he was arrested once, back in 1895, she said. The charge was helping a family obtain fraudulent documents, but the charges were dropped before trial. Looking at this portrait now, understanding what he was really doing. I don't think those documents were fraudulent at all. I think he was helping people obtain the legitimate documentation they deserved but were deliberately denied. The New York Times covered the exhibition extensively. Their article ran with a headline that captured the significance perfectly: "Hidden in Plain Sight, How Post-Reconstruction Activists Built a Secret Documentation Network." Within days of publication, historians from across the country began contacting James with their own discoveries. Similar networks had operated in Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, Baltimore. Throughout the Northeast and Midwest, parallel systems had emerged during the same historical period. All used subtle codes embedded in photographs. All worked to document and protect African American families navigating hostile systems designed to exclude them. 6 months after discovering the portrait, James stood in the Historical Society's conservation laboratory, carefully handling the glass plate negative that had changed everything he thought he understood about this period of American history. They had digitally restored dozens of Thomas Wright's photographs. Each image was now preserved and accessible to descendants and researchers studying this remarkable chapter of community resistance. The mother and daughter's portrait had become iconic, reproduced in textbooks, featured in documentary films, displayed in museums across the country. But for James, its power remained deeply personal. He thought of Eleanor Morrison, born into bondage in Virginia, carrying her infant daughter north toward freedom after the war, building a life of dignity and purpose in Brooklyn, helping countless families navigate systems designed to exclude them, training her daughters in the same work of community protection. He thought of her posing for this photograph with Ruth and Grace, their hands carefully positioned in codes that would preserve their place in history long after they were gone. Patricia Johnson had donated Eleanor's personal papers to the Historical Society, letters, a diary, business records from her seamstress work. In one diary entry, Eleanor had written about the photograph, "Had our portrait made today. Mr. Wright is a kind man who understands what we are building together. The girls were nervous, but I told them this picture will matter. Someday people will see what we did here. They will understand, *. She had been right. The photograph mattered. It preserved not just their images, but evidence of their resistance, their creativity, their refusal to be erased from a history that wanted to forget them. Sarah had traced 63 families through the network, documenting how they had obtained property deeds, legal marriages, business licenses, and school records via the shadow system. These were fundamental rights that should have been automatic for any citizen. Instead, they had required elaborate workarounds, careful planning, and the coordinated efforts of an entire secret community. The network operated from roughly 1888 to 1897, helping hundreds of families before gradually dissolving as some activists passed away, others relocated, and new challenges demanded new responses. Thomas Wright continued his photography until his death in 1923, his contribution largely forgotten until James pulled that portrait from the estate sale box. Robert Hayes practiced law until 1910, never publicly discussing the network he had helped build. Eleanor Morrison lived to see both her daughters married and established in their own lives, her quiet work of community protection continued by others who learned from her example. The network couldn't solve systemic injustice. It couldn't transform a nation that remained hostile to black equality. But it provided practical assistance to people who desperately needed it. It created documentation when official systems refused. It preserved dignity when mainstream America offered only degradation. James met regularly with descendants now, collecting oral histories, connecting families who shared this hidden heritage without knowing it. The portrait had become more than historical evidence, it was a bridge between generations, proof that their ancestors had been resourceful, connected, and absolutely determined to create justice when official America denied it. He thought of Eleanor's hands, positioned deliberately in that Brooklyn studio in 1892, her fingers creating codes that would outlive her by more than a century, carrying her story forward to a time when it could finally be told and understood. The simplest gestures can hold the most profound truths. Sometimes you just need to look closely enough to see what has been there all along, waiting patiently to be discovered.